You're standing at a river that marks the boundary between your territory and theirs. On the opposite bank, a group approaches. They're not attacking. They're not running. They're walking deliberately, slowly, making themselves visible. Your people tense. Every instinct you have screams danger. These are the tribe that raided your settlement 3 winters ago, killed 2 of your hunters, took women and supplies. But your leader gives a signal, and you don't reach for your weapon. Instead, you step forward into the shallow water, and so does the person across from you. You're both unarmed, both exposed, both betting your lives that the other side understands what's happening. The person extends their hand. You have no written treaty, no formal agreement, no way to enforce anything. What you have is the mutual understanding that if you kill this person, the alliance dies with them. And without the alliance, your tribe will be destroyed in the next conflict. So you take their hand. You shake it. You exchange gift shells, preserved meat, tools that took weeks to make. And somehow, impossibly, you've just agreed to coordinate against a third tribe that threatens you both. The question of how you got to this moment, how humans learned to trust people they should rationally fear, is one of the most fundamental questions about human nature. Ancient human tribes existed in a state of near-constant threat from other tribes. Territory was scarce. Resources were contested. Raiding was economically rational: steal food and resources from a neighboring group rather than spend the energy producing them yourself. Violence between groups was endemic. The archaeological evidence is clear on this. You find weapons cached away with evidence of use-related trauma. You find skeletons with healed skull fractures from blunt force. You find settlements positioned defensively on hilltops and protected by palisades. Warfare wasn't occasional. It was part of the seasonal rhythm, as predictable as hunts. Yet despite living in this environment of endemic conflict, humans developed the capacity to form alliances with groups they had every reason to fear. We created mechanisms that allowed groups to cooperate across tribal boundaries, to share knowledge and resources, to coordinate against common threats. This capacity wasn't based on altruism or moral evolution. It was based on something more fundamental: the ability to recognize that cooperation sometimes beat competition, and the psychological mechanisms to make that cooperation stick despite constant incentive to defect. The foundation of intertribal alliance was kinship. Not biological kinship exactly, though that mattered, but kinship as a system of obligation and reciprocity. When 2 tribes formed an alliance, the mechanism was usually marriage. A young woman from your tribe married a man from the neighboring tribe. The woman is now embedded in the other group. Her brothers and cousins maintain ties with her. Those ties create obligations. If her new tribe is attacked, your tribe has incentive to help defend her. If your tribe needs resources, her new family provides them because she's kinches. If conflicts arise between the tribes, the woman becomes a mediator, a living connection between groups that otherwise have no reason to maintain peace. This system seems simple, but the psychological and social implications are enormous. You're sending your daughter or sister to live with people you've fought against, trusting that kinship bonds will supersede tribal loyalty. The receiving tribe is accepting a stranger, incorporating her into their decision-making, treating her offspring as full members of the tribe despite different ancestry. Both sides are betting that kinship creates obligations strong enough to prevent mutual annihilation. The archaeological evidence for this system emerges as you track materials and genetic patterns across ancient populations. Objects from one region appear in settlements hundreds of miles away. Not just one or two objects, but consistent patterns suggesting ongoing exchange. Shells from coastal areas show up in inland settlements. Obsidian from volcanic regions appears in sites where no obsidian naturally occurs. The distribution patterns suggest established trade networks, suggesting that people had learned not just to tolerate other groups, but to depend on them. You can't get obsidian where you live, so you need to maintain relationships with the groups that have it. Those relationships require periodic interaction, shared understanding, and mechanisms to prevent conflicts from destroying the exchange. Similarly, genetic analysis of ancient populations reveals surprising patterns of intermarriage across large distances. DNA from individuals in one region matches DNA from populations hundreds of miles away, suggesting that marriage alliances created kinship networks that spanned huge geographic areas. Young people moved between groups. Children born of intertribal marriages carried genetic markers from both populations. Over generations, genetic mixture across tribal boundaries became increasingly common, suggesting that the barrier between us and them was more porous than warfare-centric narratives suggest. But kinship alone doesn't explain alliance formation. You need mechanisms to enforce the agreement, to make defection costly. Anthropologists studying modern tribal societies have identified several mechanisms that ancient peoples probably used. Bride price: the requirement that a man or his family pay substantial wealth to acquire a wife creates economic investment in maintaining peaceful relations. If you've paid heavily for the wife, you're committed to maintaining the relationship with her family. Gift exchange creates similar dynamics. When you give an important gift to another group, you're creating obligation. They must reciprocate, but the reciprocation is delayed, ensuring future interaction. If they refuse to reciprocate, they've signaled betrayal publicly, which damages their reputation with other trading partners. Reputation becomes a mechanism of enforcement. Groups that honor their agreements gain access to more trade networks, more allies, more resources. Groups that betray agreements become isolated, easier targets for larger coalitions. You're selecting for groups that maintain their word because the alternative is economic and military isolation. The potlatch ceremonies of Pacific Northwest peoples, documented in the historical period, reveal how elaborate these mechanisms could become. A chief would organize a massive feast, inviting neighboring tribes, distributing enormous quantities of food and valuables. The expectation was that the invited chief would reciprocate with an even larger feast. This wasn't economic logic in the modern sense. No one was trying to maximize individual wealth. Instead, the system was about demonstrating wealth and power, about creating obligation, about maintaining relationships through spectacular public performance. A chief who could afford massive feasts had sufficient resources and support to be a valuable ally. A chief who refused to participate in the potlatch system was signaling that they didn't value these relationships, which meant their group became isolated. The system worked because participation was rational, even though the logic required thinking beyond individual benefit. Shared threat was another mechanism of alliance. When a larger, more powerful tribe began expanding territory, smaller tribes had incentive to coordinate against the threat. The archaeological evidence shows this clearly in certain periods and regions. Around the time of the Mississippian expansion in North America, you see evidence of defensive structures, palisaded settlements, watchtowers appearing in peripheral regions. These settlements weren't responding to individual raids, but to organized military threat. Multiple tribes, which had previously fought with each other, suddenly coordinated to prevent conquest by a larger power. The alliance lasted only as long as the threat was salient. Once the larger tribe was defeated or redirected its expansion, the smaller tribes returned to raiding each other. The cooperation was pragmatic and temporary, lasting only as long as the logic that created it remained valid. But here's where the psychological dimension becomes crucial. Maintaining an alliance requires more than rational calculation. It requires trust, and trust is psychologically expensive in environments where betrayal is constantly possible. You have to see the other group as fundamentally similar to yourself, capable of honoring agreements, not fundamentally alien. The mechanisms that created this psychological shift involved symbolic representation and shared identity. Shared art styles created visual identity across tribal boundaries. Shared mythology stories about common ancestors or shared sacred sites created the illusion of kinship even between groups that had no actual genetic relationship. Shared ritual practices created synchronized behavior, which is psychologically powerful. When you perform identical rituals with members of another group, your brain processes them as members of your in-group rather than out-group. The ritual becomes a technology for overriding the natural tribal boundaries that human psychology otherwise reinforces. Language presents an interesting case. In many regions, multiple tribes would develop mutually intelligible dialects of a larger language family. The shared linguistic base made communication possible, but the dialectical differences marked tribal identity. You could understand outsiders, but recognize them as different through how they spoke. This created a kind of optimal middle ground, enough similarity for communication, enough difference to maintain identity. Some evidence suggests that young people trading between tribes would become multilingual, learning the dialects of multiple groups. They became cultural intermediaries, people who could speak both languages and understand both perspectives. These individuals probably played crucial roles in maintaining alliances, translating not just language but intent and cultural logic between groups. The evidence becomes even more visible when you look at symbolic exchange objects. Certain objects appear to have had value primarily as markers of alliance and status. Certain shells, certain stones, certain crafted items circulated through networks of allied tribes. An object might travel hundreds of miles, exchanged multiple times, each exchange reinforcing the relationship between trading partners. The object itself becomes a record of relationships, a physical manifestation of the social bonds created through alliance. By possessing such an object, you demonstrate that you're part of the network. You have relationships. You have status. The object functions as currency, but currency in the social and political sense rather than economic. You can't eat it or wear it effectively, but you can use it to access people and resources across vast distances. But alliance formation required managing a fundamental problem. How do you trust people who have every incentive to betray you? The archaeological evidence suggests that early alliances were probably small-scale and personal. You create an alliance with a neighboring group through kinship or gift exchange, and that alliance is maintained through personal relationships with specific individuals. If you have a brother-in-law in the neighboring group, you maintain ties with that specific person. When he dies, the alliance becomes weaker unless new kinship connections replace it. This system created natural limits on alliance scale. You could maintain alliances with a handful of neighboring groups through personal relationships, but trying to maintain alliances with dozens of groups became psychologically and logistically difficult. Alliances tended to be arranged in nested hierarchies. You had strong alliances with immediate neighbors, weaker ties with more distant groups, and those distant groups served as buffers between you and potential threats from even farther away. Over time, some societies developed institutions that could maintain alliances at larger scales. Formal positions of authority, hereditary leadership, religious roles, these created structural stability to alliances that no longer depended on personal relationships. A priest becomes an intermediary between groups, performing shared rituals, maintaining sacred sites that both groups revere. A leader becomes accountable for maintaining agreements. If they violate alliance terms, they damage not just their personal reputation, but their legitimacy to rule. The institutions create enforcement mechanisms that don't require constant personal negotiation. But this development took thousands of years. For most of human history, alliances remained small-scale, personal, and fragile. What's important to understand about these early alliances is that they weren't based on idealistic beliefs about human potential or universal brotherhood. They were based on calculations about costs and benefits. You made an alliance with another tribe because the alternative, remaining isolated, was worse. Raiding was profitable, but not as profitable as trade. War was honorable and brought prestige, but alliances prevented the scenario where two tribes equally matched destroyed each other through endless retaliatory raids. The alliance was cynical cooperation, not naive idealism. The fact that it worked didn't indicate that humans were naturally peaceful. It indicated that humans were capable of recognizing situations where violence served no purpose and cooperation served mutual interest. That recognition didn't erase tribal identity or reduce the likelihood of conflict. It just meant that conflicts between allied groups took different forms: competitive games, verbal sparring, ritual insults that didn't escalate to lethal violence. But interpreting the evidence of intertribal alliance requires acknowledging significant uncertainty. The presence of foreign objects in archaeological sites tells us that exchange occurred, but not the mechanisms that made exchange possible. Genetic evidence shows mixture between populations, but mixture doesn't necessarily indicate peaceful alliance. Trade goods could have resulted from peaceful exchange or from violent conquest and tribute. DNA from different regions could indicate kinship alliances or could result from raids that incorporated captured women into new populations. When we find evidence of shared artistic or religious traditions across regions, we interpret it as indicating alliance, but it could also indicate conquest by a shared dominant culture. Archaeological evidence is ambiguous, and our interpretation reflects assumptions about ancient societies that might not be accurate. Moreover, the emphasis on alliance formation might overstate the degree of cooperation in ancient societies. For every case where tribal groups managed to create stable alliances, there were probably multiple cases where attempted alliances failed, where defection destroyed agreements, where accumulated grievances prevented cooperation. The archaeological record preserves the exceptions more than the patterns. We see the great trade networks, the elaborate gift exchange systems, the intertribal marriages that lasted generations. We don't see the failed alliance attempts, the abandoned trade relationships, the intertribal marriages that created new conflicts rather than preventing them. The bias toward visible success creates a skewed picture of how common successful alliance actually was. But when you aggregate the evidence from multiple regions and time periods, a pattern emerges. Humans developed the capacity to create stable relationships with groups they had fought against. They did this through kinship systems, through gift exchange, through shared ritual and identity markers. They recognized that strategic cooperation sometimes beat unlimited conflict. and they created institutions to maintain that cooperation. The psychological orientation required for this achievement was specific. The ability to see members of other groups as capable of honor and agreement. The ability to maintain trust despite prior betrayals. The willingness to incorporate outsiders into your group through marriage and kinship. These capacities didn't eliminate tribalism or violence. They coexisted with warfare, raiding, and fierce tribal identity. But they allowed humans to extend cooperation beyond immediate kinship groups, to create networks that transcended tribal boundaries, to build systems where mutually beneficial exchange could persist despite underlying conflicts. The mechanism that made this possible was, ultimately, the same mechanism that allowed humans to build any complex social structure. Shared fiction. You created stories about kinship that weren't literally true. You treated objects as sacred even though they had no inherent power. You performed rituals that served no practical function but created psychological states where you felt connected to outsiders. These weren't deceptions in the intentional sense. Both sides believed in the stories and symbols. But the beliefs were constructed, maintained through repetition and cultural transmission, sustained by the mutual interest in believing them. The alliance persisted not because it was natural or inevitable, but because maintaining the social fiction was rational. You needed the relationship more than you needed to violate it. What makes this relevant to understanding modern systems is recognizing that all human alliances, ancient or contemporary, operate on similar logic. You form alliances with rivals because isolation is worse than compromise. You maintain those alliances through shared symbols, shared narratives, shared identity markers. You create institutions and hierarchies that enforce agreement without requiring constant personal negotiation. And the entire system depends on shared fiction, the belief that the other side will honor their commitments, that reputation matters, that breaking agreements creates consequences. When you strip away the specifics, this describes both ancient tribal alliances and modern international relationships. We're still creating meaning through exchange. We're still using kinship language to describe political relationships. We're still performing rituals that create psychological states of belonging and obligation. The mechanisms have remained constant because the underlying psychology has remained constant. The question worth sitting with is whether those mechanisms are becoming stronger or weaker as societies grow larger and more impersonal. Can you maintain the fiction of kinship and shared identity across millions of people? Or does trust require the scale where people actually know each other? The answer might determine whether modern alliances remain stable or fragment under pressure.